Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Schwartz with Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar on our recently published report on data and analysis for distribution system planning. Next slide. I'm joined today by co-authors Sean Murphy, Guillermo Pereira, and Cody Davis, and we thank the U.S. Department of Energy for funding this study. Our report aims to increase understanding of the types of data that utilities use and can provide to regulators and stakeholders, how the utility uses the data in planning, and how the data and analysis affects utility decisions and regulatory decision-making. Today's webinar will discuss a recently published report on this work. But before we get to the details, a few housekeeping items. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode. Please use the Q&A box to enter your questions at any time. We'll answer your questions following the presentation. Slides are posted to our project website, and we'll put that link in the chat box in a moment. We're also going to post a recording of the webinar at that site soon. And also check out our complimentary report on data and analyses for grid resilience planning. Next slide. So our research for the report included interviews with representatives of electric utilities, public utility commissions, and state energy offices, and reviewing the utility distribution system plans filed with commissions across the country. We chose 11 distribution system planning topics, and we identified the data and analysis relevant to them. The topics are listed here, and we'll cover each of these briefly during today's webinar. For additional topics, see our interactive decision framework for integrated distribution system planning. And importantly, we created a data collection tool, an Excel-based tool that's posted at the website for the project that utility regulators, state energy offices, and other stakeholders can adapt to meet their own needs. Next slide. And utilities too, of course. So for interviews, they provided some insights on the approaches, challenges, and impacts of sharing all these data and analyses. So some of the common approaches we heard about for data sharing include the annual utility reports that are filed, creating online data portals, data requests in regulatory proceedings, and also in stakeholder meetings. A lot of data is shared there. Both regulators and stakeholders found value in extensive data reporting, but they also noted challenges, things like the format of the data, lack of standardization, and volume of data. We also heard ways to overcome these challenges, including establishing filing requirements on data in rules or at the start of the distribution planning process, determining what data overlaps with other filings, what data might be missing, or it may be really superfluous. And some of the ways that interviewees use the distribution planning data that utilities provided, including comparing distribution planning expenditures over time, reviewing and validating modeling by the utility, tracking the reliability performance of the utility, and informing review of grid investments. So let's get started with the 11 data categories that we dug into. Sean?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Murphy. I'll start this off by talking about load and distributed energy resource forecasting. So in load forecasting, utilities are estimating peak demand at specific locations on the distribution system to inform the timing, need, and type of distribution system investments. This table summarizes some of the key categories of data in load and DER forecasting, and it touches it at a high level, and then we're going to walk through some of the more specific aspects of it. Often utilities relate historical peak demand to weather and economic data through a regression analysis, and then project that relationship into the future to create what we call a gross load forecast. This is the starting point of a load forecast, and it doesn't yet account for the impacts of load modifying technologies and distributed energy resources, such as rooftop solar. Some of the key data here are how they configure the model itself, the parameters, and sort of the data sources. Load forecasts can also include a range of data on the load modifying technologies and distributed generation, which impact the gross load and produce a net load forecast. I'll be going into more detail on that in the following slide. Data on the gross load forecast and load modifying technologies are important because they provide transparency for regulators and stakeholders and enable them to validate utility decisions and propose alternatives. Utilities can also report when and where new construction will occur and how large it will be. And finally, utilities can report the outputs of the forecasts, namely peak demand, which is really important for understanding future grid conditions and identifying drivers of change on the distribution grid. So distributed generation and load modifying technologies can include rooftop solar, energy efficiency, demand response, and batteries. For each of these technologies, utilities can report key assumptions about their level of adoption as well as their operations. Technology adoption estimates can be system-wide or at the feeder level and can vary by customer class. This figure on the right here shows National Grid New York's estimated system-wide adoption of heat pumps for both residential and commercial customers. They then allocate this system-wide estimate to feeder level based on the likelihood of adoption as a function of different demographic characteristics. Operational assumptions that can be used in developing forecasts impact the load shapes of the load modifying technologies and distributed generation. So this could be things like the type of charging strategy that EVs use or the efficiency of the technology. These assumptions can get technical and granular, but they are really important because they affect when and how much power these technologies use. Since technology adoption can be uncertain and there's many ways that these technologies can operate, utilities can handle this uncertainty by developing scenarios that reflect differences in some of these assumptions about the operation and adoption of the load modifying distributed generation technologies. So now I just want to talk on some of the leading practices for data sharing and load and DER forecasting. Utilities can first identify the parameters that are used in the gross load forecasts, and then provide feeder level adoption estimates for DER and load modifying technologies. Utilities can develop forecasts around scenarios that differ in some of those key assumptions, which enable comparisons across the scenarios. And utilities can do more than just provide a single hour peak demand estimate. They can provide hourly load shapes for peak days that include the impacts of the DERs and other technologies. So this figure on the right here shows how Green Mountain Power did just that. So I think there's EVs in green and heat pumps in red, showing how those vary over time and add to the other loads that were forecasted. Utilities can also provide similar forecasted peak demand by circuit. So now I'll talk about scenario planning or scenario analysis. In this planning activity, utilities consider a range of plausible futures that are based on potential trajectories of different planning drivers. So scenarios can identify challenges and risks to the distribution system and help manage uncertainty by analyzing a range of conditions. Importantly, the scenarios don't represent everything that could happen on the grid may face, but they do set some bounds on what may and explore those likely possibilities. On their scenarios, utilities can provide narratives that describe the structure of the scenarios, the assumptions that differentiate the scenarios, and the implications of each scenario on planning activities. So in terms of structure, utilities may create sort of discrete ones that explore potential outcomes that help determine like least to regret investments in the distribution system, or they can explore sort of alternative futures, such as a base case compared to a low and a high. Go into a little bit more detail about the scenario assumptions in the implications on the next slides. So utilities can define scenarios relative to whatever drivers of uncertainty they think are relevant. Often these scenarios can reflect technology adoption levels and efficiency and operations. In distribution system plans, utilities can provide documentation on the assumptions that define these scenarios. And this documentation helps regulators and other stakeholders validate the utility assumptions and determine whether they're aligning with state policies and expected market changes. This table that we show here is from Hawaiian Electric's 2023 Integrated Grid Plan. It identifies several parameters that define 10 different scenarios, including the use of managed and unmanaged EV charging and fuel efficiency. Summary tables like this can really help clarify what differentiates scenarios. It first explains what differentiates them, and then it helps you understand sort of how you can make comparisons between the scenarios to gain insights from the scenario analysis. For different scenarios, utilities can provide narratives that identify potential challenges and risks to the distribution system and planning activities. These narratives can make regulators more aware of the risks the system faces, and they provide a starting point for analysis and how to mitigate those risks. Utilities can apply these scenarios to different planning activities and report data on the results. So this figure we have here, just from Salt River Project's 2023 Integrated System Plan, they applied different economic scenarios to their load forecast and then their grid needs assessment, which produced these estimates of the different needs for substation bay additions across the scenarios. And this type of analysis helps relate those scenario assumptions to different investment drivers, such as the substation bays. Some leading practices in data sharing for scenario analysis can include describing the structure of scenarios used and the uncertainties that each scenario addresses, documenting the key assumptions that differentiate those scenarios, and then providing narratives that identify risks and challenges. Utilities can also report scenario-specific data on planning activities, just like that example from the Salt River Project. So now I'll talk about worst performing circuit analysis. In this planning activity, utilities analyze the duration, frequency, and the number of service interruptions that customers face to identify the circuits with the worst reliability. In reports, utilities can provide data on the metrics and criteria for identifying worst performing circuits, as well as the characteristics of those worst performing circuits. And this provides important context for how utilities can address reliability issues through remediation efforts. And then last is the remediation plans, which show how the utilities are actually responding to known reliability issues. So utilities identify worst performing circuits by ranking circuits by various reliability metrics and then applying screening criteria to those metrics. The table to the right summarizes some of these common metrics that utilities use. And importantly, the outcome of this worst performing circuit analysis can depend on the metrics that you use. I won't go through each of these because it can get a little technical, but one thing I want to draw out is that these metrics can differ in whether they're addressing the duration or the frequency of interruptions, and whether they're considering all customers or just those impacted by interruptions. So the choice of metric here can affect whether you're choosing circuit 1 or 2 as the worst performing. Additionally, the type of interruptions that are considered in this analysis can impact which circuits are worst performing. Some utilities may include or exclude interruptions that result from severe storms, for example. And finally, the time frame of the analysis can have an impact. If you look at 1 year, a single storm can really affect the outcome. But if you look over the past 3 or 5 years, you have a broader sense of what reliability looks like across the distribution system. Often, utilities take these rankings and then select the 1 or 3% that have the worst metric score as a way of selecting the worst performing circuits. So some of the characteristics that utility on these circuits that can include technical details like the voltage or the line length, which provides an important context for the causes of interruptions. Utilities can also provide data on the event history. So these are what caused the interruption, and that can inform the mitigation strategies. And utilities can also provide the reliability performance metrics so that regulators are able to track the performance of these circuits over time. And finally, utilities can provide a sort of history of the maintenance, which can include tree trimming dates, stuff like that, which informs the extent to which utilities have made progress in addressing some of these issues. The figure or the table to the right comes from New York State Electric and Gas's 2022 annual reliability report. And it sort of summarizes a number of these circuit characteristics. Together, all these data paint a picture for the issues that are affecting a circuit. And this helps regulators know what issues are really affecting circuits. So for example, in this table, trees were the most common source of interruptions, but non-utility accidents were the largest source of interruptions. So all of this detail helps regulators and stakeholders understand what's happening, what's causing these issues in reliability, and informs the solutions that you can take to remediate them. And for leading practices in worst performing circuit analysis, utilities can first report how they're choosing these metrics, which interruptions are excluded from the metric calculation, as well, and be transparent about the screening criteria that they're using for circuit identification. Utilities can also report detailed data on worst performing circuits and provide information on the remediation plans that address those issues, including the cost, timeline, and the description of the planned work. I'll hand things over to Cody.
Excellent. Thanks, Sean. So we're going to talk a little bit about asset management strategy and the tie-ins that it has with distribution system planning. Asset management is the process by which utilities establish their inventory of distribution system assets, analyze the condition and performance of those assets, and subsequently make capital and maintenance spending decisions in order to efficiently maintain safety and reliability on the system. This may include sort of design standards and guidelines and equipment standards on sort of the input equipment that builds the physical pieces that make up the infrastructure. Asset health and reliability data may also be reported to kind of keep track of performance over time. And then those inputs kind of make up potential modifications to support programmatic or discrete asset management investments to improve the condition, improve reliability, or otherwise prevent asset failure. Next slide, please. So a couple of key inputs. First, utilities can describe and report asset-related data, such as pole counts and devices from inspections, average age and equipment by type, inspection and asset health assessment programs and results that they may have, as well as overall sort of equipment design and setting strategies. In terms of outage and reliability data, these are critical inputs to sort of informing where investments need to be made to keep up with or improve poor performing areas or worse performing circuits. These may include, similar to what Sean mentioned, outage frequency and duration, either at the system, region, or circuit level, outage cause information, which also feeds into the assets underlying the performance as well, and worst performing circuits. So we have a couple examples. These are from DTE and their 2023 distribution grid plan. On the top, you will see the SAFE for all weather over certain years. And then on the bottom, sort of the outage causes by type. Next slide, please. So those are the inputs. In terms of outputs, asset health and performance data are used to make strategic decisions about where to make investments to improve reliability. These are sort of sectioned into programmatic investments, which are intended to address repeating system needs or remediate relatively widespread issues over time. It may also be used to scale up the deployment of a new technology. Tracking the investment drivers, costs, and performance of programs is very important to kind of making sure they're having their intended outcome. One example of an asset-related program is the replacement of porcelain cutouts with polymer due to elevated failure risk or potential safety issues that result from freezing. So programmatic investments are sort of widespread or have these wider approaches. Discrete investments are intended to address specific needs at specific locations based on actual reliability, asset health, or safety considerations. It does get a little confusing because a lot of times these discrete investments are reported in spending categories rather than as individual projects. So you may see, for example, on the Minnesota Excel's 2023 IDP, there are these categories that contain a lot of these individual projects. So within age-related replacements and asset renewal, or within capacity expansion projects, there are specific projects at discrete locations kind of based on actual drivers. Next slide, please. Leading practices for data sharing and asset management. Clearly identify the criteria used to assess asset condition and to justify replacement. For programmatic investments, providing data to demonstrate the need for that investment, such as I mentioned the cutout failure program here. You can see the reliability impacts considered in sort of defending and funding that program, as well as identifying reportable data to make sure you're seeing that performance over time. And then sharing equipment selection and design practices, especially to the extent they are impacted by changing grid conditions, like a wildfire preparedness would be another kind of good example there. And the next slide, and I think I'm handing it over.
Yes, thanks, Cody. So for hosting capacity analysis, utilities determine the amount of DERs that they can interconnect without either infrastructure upgrades or adversely impacting power quality or reliability under existing control and protection systems. The data that hosting capacity analysis and distribution system planning reports can contain include first an analytical framework that provides transparency to regulators and helps them validate utility decisions. This may just identify criteria for updating hosting capacity analysis and identifying key methodological decisions in the hosting capacity analysis. Utilities can also report data on distribution system infrastructure attributes. So that could be knowing about what the circuits are, where they are, technical information on them, and that itself can inform the siting of DERs without doing load flow simulations. Utilities can also report load characteristics such as peak demand and DER capacity, both the amount installed and the amount in queue. That information also can be important for informing the siting of DERs and new loads. And of course, hosting capacity analysis can produce estimates of hosting capacity, which I'll speak in more detail about on the next slide. And utilities can also provide data on mitigation analyses that they conduct. Mitigation analysis can increase hosting capacity by systematically addressing constraints. So data here can provide transparency and provide insight into utility decisions and potential alternatives. Utilities can report hosting capacity data for generation, such as rooftop PV, load, such as the electric vehicles or heat pumps, as well as battery storage. On the right here, we show an image from Excel Colorado's generation hosting capacity map. The pop-up window shows the outputs for hosting capacity in a node within one of the feeders, and it includes data on the hosting capacity, distribution system infrastructure information. So I think there's maybe like an ID for one of the feeders, and also identifies the constraints that limit hosting capacity. So all this detailed information is really helpful for developers in understanding what's affecting a potential site for a DER development. Hosting capacity values may be in ranges or in values specific to distribution system equipment. So this example is on the more detailed side, but sometimes you'll see more of a heat map that just gives us a range of the potential hosting capacity. In general, more granular information enables more informed decision making. Utilities can publish hosting capacity data in maps like this, downloadable spreadsheets, or also through APIs. These formats can reduce the volume of data requests and help developers access information that they need to understand whether system upgrades are likely necessary to support new DER installations. Some leading practices for hosting capacity or data sharing and hosting capacity analysis include first documenting the types of constraints considered and the threshold for each constraint. This table on the right here from Excel Energy identifies some of the constraints that they've considered in hosting capacity analysis. So this can include things like voltage deviation, unintentional islanding. Utilities can also make node level data publicly available, such as through maps, so the more granular, the better. And they can also identify strategies to mitigate hosting capacity. So in this same table on the right, Excel Energy identifies different strategies they've identified for mitigating each of those different constraints to hosting capacity. And information on this is helpful, and it's helpful for non-technical audiences to learn this through in reporting and understand the strategies that are available to address hosting capacity constraints. Finally, utilities can describe the criteria and the costs for updating hosting capacity modeling tools and capabilities. These can be analytically intensive exercises, so understanding how frequently and how much it costs for a utility to perform the analysis can allow regulators to understand sort of trade-offs in terms of investment versus the improvements in the hosting capacity analyses. Things back to Cody.
Awesome. So the next item is the value of DER, which is an attempt to quantify the benefits of DERs to the distribution system, generally in order to inform customer compensation or programs or otherwise guide deployment. A couple of key data categories to consider in value of DER are the distribution system input data itself, including growth expectations, capacity needs, and historical costs for upgrades. DER input data on the types of DER considered and the associated performance, as well as sort of what value drivers are being considered and quantified within the analysis. All of these things combine to provide outputs that can impact planning by informing program design and affecting future distribution planning needs. Next slide, please. Okay, so the types of value drivers that are considered, we're focused primarily on the distribution side here, but there are sort of a full value stack of potential impacts to all basically upstream assets. So distribution connected assets can have positive impacts on the generation side, the transmission side, with respect to environmental, societal, or other kind of economic or community benefits. Those may be considered as part of a value stack depending on utility jurisdiction and other kind of program design goals. Within the distribution system, there are a wide range of potential value drivers that can be considered. Capacity value is probably the most prevalent and generally the highest magnitude. This would be DER and the ability to delay or avoid the need to build additional distribution capacity by offsetting local load and reducing the peak demand that's measured. Other distribution value streams include reducing power flow losses, supporting voltage and power quality, depending on the type, increasing hosting capacity, for example, battery storage charging during high PV hours. Other benefits that may be considered include reliability and resilience through sort of targeted outage reduction, potential O&M, asset health, and other kind of DER impacts. One of the important things to consider is the actual types of DERs that are being considered in an analysis or in a program, which may have very different capabilities. So is it standalone solar? Is it intended to be solar plus storage, just storage? Does it include things like demand response or controllable loads? Or is the study kind of intended to be technology agnostic, where different types of DER can have their operating profiles and capabilities sort of imposed on a methodology that is sort of stands above any of the specific technology pieces. So these are the drivers and DER considerations that feed into value of DER. Next slide, please. Leading practices for data sharing related to the value of DER include identifying specifically the types of DER being considered in the analysis and to explain the DER performance assumptions used in those studies. For example, if you're looking at solar, where does the operating profile of that solar come from? It may be NREL's PV Watts tool, it may be from historical data. But knowing where the data comes from and how the DER being assumed to be controlled adds a lot of value to the process. Identifying the distribution value streams considered and the methodologies specifically used for quantifying them is a really key element that is a central focus of value of DER analysis. And then to the extent practical, capture variations in DER value due to actual locational differences in grid needs. DER are primarily impacting resources by reducing the peak load, generally only on assets that are upstream of them. So if you have an overload and you put a new DER sort of upstream of that overload, you're not physically reducing the load that flows through the asset, right? So the location is a key factor. You may have higher values in areas with capacity constraints, and that's an important thing to consider when designing and looking at value of DER reporting. And I will pass it to Guillermo.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Sean. So yeah, in terms of grid needs assessment, this is the process utilities follow and the analysis to determine grid deficiencies over a set period of time. For example, they could look 10 years into the future to determine any grid needs in their system. This type of assessment benefits from planning and integrated planning, particularly because it leverages data from load and DER forecasting, as well as scenario analysis that Sean was just presenting on. Key data categories for grid needs assessment include providing information on the scope of the assessment, what are the objectives, are there any regulatory requirements the objective has to deliver on, what is the analytical approach the utility is following, and information in this regard can include the methodology, any limitations, any tools that are being implemented to support the analysis. Utilities can also provide data on the grid needs they're identifying, what are the specific assets affected, as well as their selection process. If they are prioritizing grid needs for investments, how do they do that? Next slide, please. If we look into the specific data related to grid needs identified, in this case, utilities can provide information on the asset characteristics. This can include where the asset is located in the service territory, as well as a unique identifier to be able to track that asset. It can include cost estimates. For example, on the right, you can see an example from Hawaiian Electric and their estimates to address grid needs over different scenarios from their 2023 integrated grid plan. Utilities can also provide data on timing. When is this grid need expected to occur, in which year? And often they can also provide information about the season in which the grid need is expected to unfold, as well as the time of day when the grid need is most affecting the system. Utilities can also provide information on the engineering characteristics of the grid need identified. For example, what are the operational conditions of the system when the grid need actually occurs? Is this during a normal operation condition? Is this during an unplanned contingency? And this can allow regulators and other stakeholders to understand the severity and the priority of that grid need to be addressed. Data on grid needs assessment is important because it not only allows regulators to understand the process utilities are following, but it also allows them to assess and determine if that process is robust and appropriate to identify grid needs that advance distribution system capabilities. Next slide, please. In terms of leading practices in this space, utilities can provide data and the analytical steps followed to identify grid needs, which can increase transparency in the process they follow and allow stakeholders to understand the process to identify those grid needs. They can also disclose information on any commercial or utility developed tools and what is their role in the analysis to make sure that there isn't a tool that isn't well understood by stakeholders, and this can create opportunities for educating and sharing information on the tools used by the utility. Another best practice includes also leveraging data portals to facilitate data access. And on the right, you can see a snapshot from NV Energies in Nevada online portal for grid needs assessment data, where they allow stakeholders to access information on any feeders and substation affected by grid constraints, as well as information on the severity of those grid constraints. Next slide, please. In terms of cost effectiveness evaluation of investments, this is where utilities assess the benefits and cost of different distribution system investments to support planning objectives and guide future action. Key data categories in this space include solution justification data, such as what investments are being analyzed, what are the expected outcomes. Utilities can also provide information around their screening approach and their analytical process. What is the methodology? What are the estimates of benefits and costs in their analysis? And they can also provide information on their portfolio development approach. How are they scoring and ranking the different investments analyzed to select the ones that will be pursued? Next slide, please. When you looking at the solution justification data, in this case, utilities can provide information about the selected capital investments and the associated operating expenses. They can also disclose information related to the drivers for that investment. And the figure on the right, you can see potential drivers in the middle of the figure, such as complying with commission requirements or enabling new distribution system capabilities. Utilities can also share information on any investment alternatives considered when that is feasible, as well as describe the cost-effectiveness methodology. For some investments, the utility may pursue a lowest reasonable cost approach. For other investments, the utility may follow a benefit cost analysis, and this would be where the utility describes the method and explains why the method selected is suitable and adequate for the investment they are analyzing. This information is important because it allows regulators and other stakeholders participating in these processes to understand the rationale that the utility follows to determine cost effectiveness and assess if it matches regulatory priorities or requirements in place for cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. In terms of leading practices in this space, utilities can provide data to characterize the expenditures evaluated for cost effectiveness. They can ensure transparency between expenditures and how they contribute to distribution planning objectives so that stakeholders can understand the link between the investments being proposed and how they advance distribution system modernization and other goals. And they can also provide information on any methods of prioritizing investments after determining cost effectiveness. And on the right, you can see an example from Portland General Electric, which shows the different dimensions the utility uses and considers when ranking investments to determine their portfolio. And this includes safety, reliability, and risk, for example. And on the right side of the figure, you can see the different weights the utility assigns to those different dimensions. Next slide, please. In terms of distribution system investment strategy and implementation, this is where the utility establishes a long-term strategic plan to achieve distribution system objectives in an affordable way over a determined planning horizon included in their plan. In this case, utilities can provide two main categories of data. One of them relates to strategy development, and this establishes the long-term evolution of the distribution system. It can include a vision, objectives, and other approaches to determining that long-term vision. And they can also provide information related to strategy implementation, which connects that long-term vision with near-term actions included in the plan. Next slide, please. Zooming into the data related to strategy development, in this case, utilities can describe their vision or provide a vision statement. And for example, you can see on the right, Southern California Edison's grid modernization vision, which includes not only the investments the utility plans to prioritize at the bottom of the figure, but it also links those investments to specific benefits at the top of the figure. Utilities can also demonstrate their objectives and describe what they are trying to deliver with their strategy and the drivers behind it, as well as provide a roadmap that places different investment priorities and strategies into a timeline and describes the connection between different priorities and activities and how they may depend on one another. This information is important for regulators and other stakeholders because it allows them to assess and understand if the proposed investments in the plan align and advance the utility's vision, as well as state policy goals and any commission priorities. And this is also important because it adds transparency to the planning process by demonstrating how the utility translates planning objectives into specific expenditure decisions presented in their plans. Next slide, please. Leading practices in this space include providing data to communicate the proposed distribution system evolution effectively, as well as reporting on progress and future investment needs. And this example on the right shows DTE's, Michigan DTE's summary of progress on different areas that the utility designates as strategic investments, which include automation, hardening, for example, and conversion of assets. Next slide, please. In terms of geo-targeted programs, these are the programs the utility implements to reduce load growth in specific locations in the system, typically to help reduce, defer, or mitigate the need for system upgrades. These programs are typically designed to offer incentives for customers to adopt DERs in the specific locations that are being targeted, and the utility can provide data related to the needs the program is trying to address, what are the assets. They can provide data related to the program design and deployment, as well as how they are going to evaluate program performance to ensure the program is effective. Next slide, please. Looking at the data related to program design and deployment. In this case, utilities can provide information on the measures eligible. And you can see an example on the right from a geo-targeted program in Excel service territory in Minnesota, where they outline the different measures included in the program, as well as how they contribute to reducing load in the specific asset that is being targeted. Utilities can also provide information on the program duration, customer participation, if different classes are included, what is expected, what is the expected contribution of different classes on the program's success, as well as any incentive types and their structure and characteristics, and when customers are eligible for those incentives. This information is valuable and allows regulators and other stakeholders to understand the portfolio of measures, which can allow them to determine if that portfolio is optimal and effective to deliver the program goals that are being presented. And this data is also important because it can enable regulators to better understand the characteristics of programs that the utility may be proposing to adapt to include a geo-targeted component, or a new program proposal that may be before the commission for consideration. Next slide, please. Leading practices in this space include providing data that clearly specifies program goals and characterizes the need that the program is trying to address. In this case, utilities can also share data on the locational and temporal characteristics of the targeted grid need. They can also report data on the eligible measures, as we were just discussing, to understand the portfolio of measures that are expected to deliver program goals effectively. And lastly, utilities can also report regularly on program effectiveness and progress. And on the right side of the slide, you can see an example from Consolidated Edison in New York, where they provide load reduction data from the program every quarter to the commission. This report is publicly available, and it includes a series of summary tables outlining progress and the different measures and the success of those measures in delivering load reduction. And I believe it's back to Sean now.
Thanks, Guillermo. So this is our last distribution system planning topic to cover before we move into the Q&A, which is non-wires alternatives, or NWAs. Utilities can use NWA, non-wires alternatives, to use DERs to provide grid services at specific locations on the distribution system that can either defer, reduce, or avoid the need for upgrades, pending that they meet certain suitability criteria. Some of the key categories for non-wires alternatives that utilities can report include the suitability criteria, which I'll get to in more detail in the next slide, but is generally making sure that it is this is an appropriate occasion for a non-wires alternative. There are also technical and cost effectiveness screens to make sure that it's performing as needed and is a cost-effective solution. Utilities can also provide data on NWA opportunities, which characterize the grid need, to give developers information that they need to develop solutions and solicitations. And there can also be information on the procurement process itself, which can set expectations for non-wires alternative providers by describing the timeline, review process, and bid evaluation criteria and bidding rules, so that they can go into a solicitation in an informed manner. And finally, utilities can describe evaluation frameworks that provide data requirements and performance metrics, which can lay out or can help developers achieve the expected outcomes. So utilities identify distribution needs suitable for non-wires alternatives using criteria that can include the type of project, the timing of the grid need, and the cost of the traditional solution. So this table on the right is an example of how Consolidated Edison in New York assesses the suitability of projects for non-wires alternatives. One thing I'll point out here is that there's sort of a minimum cost to make sure that it's actually worthwhile to do the analysis, then it's practical, because otherwise you'll be spending money on something, and if it costs more to do the analysis than the actual project, it wouldn't make sense. Additionally, utilities can do these technical and cost effectiveness screens on projects that they determine are suitable. So these screens can identify eligible technologies and can include assumptions on DER costs and performance. There's a lot of assumptions that go into a technical and cost effectiveness screen, and it is a place where utilities can be transparent and reveal how some of these decisions can be made. Transparency across and all assumptions on these screening processes is important because it helps regulators and stakeholders understand the screening results and know how utilities made decisions about whether to pursue non-WARS alternatives. And also it provides an opportunity for regulators to propose alternative screening criteria. Some of the leading practices for data sharing in non-WARS alternatives include clearly describing the criteria for suitability, making clear that sure that those are clear to regulators and stakeholders, as well as documenting the methods and assumptions for the technical and cost effectiveness screening. Utilities can also use a technology agnostic approach as a leading practice and present detailed information on the opportunities to developers. This data can include the location, the timing, and the magnitude of the grid need, sort of gives the characteristics that enables a developer to develop a solution. Additionally, adequate grid data is useful for developers so they understand the physical context of the grid in which they're proposing a solution. Standard pro forma agreements can also support the solicitation process, and a performance evaluation framework that includes data requirements and performance metrics can set up developers to perform as expected and needed. And with that, I think we can turn to our Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Sean and Guillermo and Cody. We've got a lot of questions. We will ask the co-presenters to try to give short answers. First off, this is the obvious question, and it was an early one. This is a lot of information. So you have suggestions on how to prioritize the data and analysis that regulators and stakeholders might focus on. So my first start is, the stuff that's really making a difference in utility decision-making and regulatory decision-making, like some follow-up. Who wants to start?
I can take a first stab. There's definitely a lot of topics. I think it makes sense to kind of focus on what's most important in your particular jurisdiction at the time. So if that's reliability related issues like asset management, WPCs and stuff will be a lot more top of mind. If it's more sort of DER integration focused or load growth focused, and like what are the top 3 things you're most worried about, I would kind of zoom in on those topics first and kind of just keep a log that some of the other topics may be there in case you need them in the future. But there's a lot to engage with at once. I think it makes sense to sort of prioritize and just be aware of other solutions and materials that may be helpful in the future or for colleagues.
Any other very quick reactions?
Yeah, I guess a quick, oh, go ahead, Sean.
No, please.
I was going to say, often within proceedings, there are subgroups of stakeholders that have different priorities. So there's a chance that a wider set of data, topics, and assets can be covered across different stakeholders so that a specific one doesn't have to cover all the data aspects we covered today. So there's an opportunity to allow for some distribution of effort there as well.
Yeah, and also add, load forecasting is often upstream of many other planning activities, and it can be a useful place to start because you at least have a foundational piece of information and understanding of the future grid conditions that you're trying to address in the rest of the distribution system planning.
Great. I have a quick question for Cody. How often do utilities factor in overloading information as part of asset health and safety programs, such as upgraded wires, which are typically based on age or SAG inspections?
Yeah, planning and asset management historically are separate departments. More modern practices have them at least handshaking so that if asset management's replacing a device, the planning folks get involved to size it appropriately over the life. If the planning folks need capacity, they coordinate with the asset management folks to make sure they're like taking a holistic perspective on what that upgrade should be based on the assets they have. So it's gotten a lot better. There's always room for improvement, but that coordination is really important.
Great. I'm going to keep moving on so we answer a lot of questions. I'm not sure if this was related to hosting capacity or any mention of interconnection. So what does backup in the queues mean? Cody, you want to take that?
Yeah, I would interpret that to mean you have a lot of applications all in the same place that you have to process in order that can take a long time. So hosting capacity can show you if there's 50 applications ahead of you when you apply, you should expect to wait a while before you might see the results of a study.
And I'll note that we have a new interconnection project with the Solar Energy Office at DOE, and we'll be diving into some of those issues as part of their DER interconnection roadmap. So you might want to take a look at that document. This is a question, I think, for Sean. Is there an example or best practice for how utilities can share load forecasting assumptions and models in a way that allows stakeholders to produce their own independent forecasts?
That's a great question. So one example that comes to mind is something that we cite in the paper, which is from Hawaiian Electric. They had a load forecasting working group through which the utility shared a good amount of the data that underlied their forecast. So there's a spreadsheet I think we linked to in the report that shows sort of the historical, the whole time series of data that could go into the sort of gross load forecast. So in order to, you can develop your own load forecast, but it's starting with some of the foundational assumptions the utility has and the same data, I think, is necessary, because otherwise you can diverge very quickly. We also have some work that we've done at Berkeley Lab about how to incorporate building load growth into load forecasting. So there are some examples or other research that we have that shows how to use publicly available and use load profiles to develop your own load forecast, which you can provide a link to someplace.
As a follow-up, Sean, maybe you could put that in the chat box. So let's move on to another quick question, I think, for Cody. For large solar PV assets, how would you rate the importance of efficient routine inspection solutions that can scale over the next decade? And I'm just going to say, like, not sure what large is. This is all about distribution system planning, this webinar. So large for the distribution grid.
Yeah, I think for like distribution scale large assets, like inspection and maintenance is important, keeping things operational, panels operational, especially if it's tied in with any kind of utility capacity program where there are performance requirements or sort of incentives. Making sure you get the most out of it is important. There's some economic kind of tie-ins there, but I think it's pretty important, but it depends on the specific design, I think.
Okay. I'm going to keep moving on. For hosting capacity, how often do utilities update their maps? And do they evaluate hosting capacity in a granular enough way to consider the line loading limits, or only the primary wires, such as constraints posed by the feeder head wire? I'm going to toss this to Cody.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So the amount of time between updates varies widely between utilities. I think a leading practice is at least sort of monthly, if not faster is sort of an ideal. A lot of utilities right now are either quarterly or annual. Some of the data changes annually, so your peak and minimum loads that are important for hosting capacity don't change every quarter or every month, but the amount of DER or load that's connected in a place does change that fast. So you may update some values annually, other sort of locational analyses faster than that. In terms of the granularity, usually you're only looking at like primary voltage equipment. So you're not looking at like service transformer sizes, secondary conductors, but you do get the capability to go down to the individual node level. So like pick 100 feet of like single phase wire, you can run hosting capacity and get the result at that level. And most utilities are using have that level of granularity now. So it's available at that sort of level on the primary.
Great. We've got a couple questions in about the resilience value of distributed energy resources and looking for some tools and approaches for valuing those, monetizing those. I will first offer a promotion for our POET tool that we have piloted with ComEd in Illinois, and I'll put a link in the chat. But I also want to get perspectives from the panelists. So Sean, Guillermo, Cody.
I can take a first stab. DER reliability and resiliency is sort of a messy topic. In most cases, you're talking about like benefits in terms of reducing utility outage statistics like SAIFI and SAIDI. But when you have a loss of the distribution system during an outage, those assets are generally required to separate themselves from the grid or cease sort of injecting power for safety reasons. So without any kind of specific controls or other deployments, those resources aren't providing direct benefits to SAIFI or SAIDI. There are ways to use them to improve it. For example, if you're looking at deploying a microgrid for like battery storage, having more DER in that area may reduce the size of the asset you would need to deploy or may kind of increase the amount of time it can run. So there are some benefits there, especially in terms of like reliability where you're looking at microgrids or like circuit ties, but those benefits tend to be secondary and have to kind of have specific design elements of at least the grid side and any kind of microgrid to support that.
Guillermo and Sean, any follow-up? We do have a report that I'll work to put in the chat box.
I was just going to flag quickly a non-Berkeley Lab resource, but a very good resource nonetheless. The National Standard Practice Manual has a ton is the best word, a ton of resource on how to monetize different value streams, including resilience and reliability values. They have a methodologies manual that provides a range of analytical approaches from very sophisticated, you have all the resources, time, and money in the world, to less sophisticated. I need to monetize this, but I am just a stakeholder in this proceeding. And I really recommend it to take a look at possibilities on how to consider that and monetize it.
Great. Guillermo, maybe you could put a link in the chat to that.
I can do that, yes.
You get a second. JP's report on the valuing resilience for storage would be a good one.
Yes.
This is one that I've heard claims that specific hours in a year tend to drive distribution investments. Are there publicly available modeling tools to assist utility regulators to assess these claims? And I'm going to start with maybe a disclaimer. I mean, specific hours in a year are driving on the distribution system. I mean, that's how you've got, you know, no matter what it is, you've got to plan for the sort of worst case, right? To make sure we have a reliable delivery of power. So those peak hours in the year are important. The thing that's happening now is that's changing, right? Let's get some reactions from the panel. Who wants to start?
I think a starting place for that is the load forecast, because that's where utility will estimate what that peak demand will be out in time. And then that can flow into, say, a grid needs assessment analysis that I think Guillermo has spoken about, where utility may report that this will, they can produce a table. And I think we have an example of this in our report that says, we estimate that this will be the, you know, capacity or the headroom in a feeder or substation during the peak hour, 10 years out.
Any other quick reactions?
Yeah, there may be some utility reporting around like what time their coincident peak load is that feeds up into the transmission system, or like as a utility that can kind of show, all right, this is my peak hour system wide. Individual like assets, like substation transformers or lines, may peak at different times. Like you have this sort of non-coincidence. You may have some assets that peak in the winter, some that peak in the summer, some that peak at 5 p.m., some that peak at 8 p.m. But there are these peak periods for individual pieces. You can get reporting on like what the peak load magnitude is at sort of those levels with the times considered, or at kind of deaggregate from that transmission level.
I wanted to ask a question about standardization in data across utilities. So how can utility regulators manage that lack of standardization across utilities in a state? Who wants to take that?
That's a good question. It's always helpful to have standard data when you're doing an analysis. And first step is, I think you can have standardization in, or maybe two ways to think about it. Utilities can differ in how they're reporting data. And also utilities can differ over time because you have new work coming in, you may adjust how you're reporting. I think you can address both with filing requirements at the starting when you're initiating these processes. Because that can say, please define this field as X, Y, or Z. It can be helpful to have conversations with utilities at the onset and, you know, when developing these requirements to understand some of these data fields specifically. In conversations with our regulators, I think the budget categories came up as a specific example of something that varies over time within utility and across utilities. And locking in a definition can be really helpful, so you can have a sense of what does a cost increase mean? Is it specific to a specific subcategory, or is there something else going on? So I guess filing requirements and sort of developing definition, or coming to a common understanding of definitions early on.
Okay, we're getting to time, but I'm going to try to squeeze in at least one more question. Cody, this one's really for you. We've talked about this quite a bit. Can you talk about the security concerns with sharing detailed hosting capacity information?
Yes, so there are a lot of potential sort of challenges in sharing really granular utility data. One that comes up is like vulnerability of infrastructure, locations of high amounts of load. I think generally a good practice is if you can see it from Google Earth or kind of know it from walking around or looking, it's not that sensitive of data. There's a balance to kind of strike between the level of granularity that's provided and the level of like risk and security. that I think is an important conversation to navigate. There's some really good tools out there. I think it's NARUC's data sharing playbook has a lot of good material kind of analyzing those questions and looking at it. But yeah, there are concerns, but they are able to be mitigated with certain techniques.
Well, thanks so much. We have more questions, and I always have more questions, but we are at time. I want to thank our presenters, Sean Murphy, Guillermo Pereira, and Cody Davis. Encourage you to look at the report and maybe download that Excel data collection tool and see if it's worthwhile to adapt to your utility, your state, your stakeholders. Thanks so much. And the National Standard Practice Manual, I think was the citation was put in the chat box, as well as Sean, when he mentioned how to incorporate the load profiles for building and transportation electrification. All right, thanks so much. Appreciate everybody's participation today. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.